who don't quite I have still described Ronnie Kasrils as an incredibly brave, incredibly impressive, intelligent and good person. So it's a huge honor to have him here today. And after Ronnie speaks, we'll hear from Yonatan Shapira, who is a former Israeli Air Force pilot who authored the pilot's letter, which was signed by 27 Air Force pilots who said they would refuse to fly over occupied territories. He went on to participate in the flotilla to Gaza in 2012, which carried food and medicine for Palestinians. He was brutally attacked by the Israeli Defense Forces. And, you know, he was, he maybe he'll talk about it or maybe not, but he experienced an electric taser assault. But as well as his activism, he's also an artist, and he has a really wonderful, I've spent the last few days listening to his music, and he's really, it's really beautiful and excellent. And without further ado, Ronnie, will you take it from here, please?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sonia. By a donkey, I should use the South African language here with you. Wonderful to meet a fellow South African. I'm in Johannesburg, everybody. I'm honored to be with you all. Thanks for the very warm words. And I must say that I know Ireland very well, both from history and being there many times. And the struggle of the Irish people against British colonialism resonated in my mind and heart when I became political. And I must say that the influence of the Irish struggle for justice and freedom against British colonialism has made a big impact on the South African liberation movement, and not just the armed struggle aspect. You've heard a little bit about me, so I'd like to simply state at the onset that I was born in a very significant era. I was born in 1938, and obviously then grew up during the war years. 7-year-old going for 8 at the end of the war. And at that sort of age, one was very sensitized to the struggle against fascism and a character called Hitler, who we used to ape in the school playgrounds and so on. So I had become a little sensitized to that particular horrible period, and so rejoiced with everybody else, except some extreme right-wingers in South Africa. And there were quite a number of such white supremacists when that war ended in victory against fascism. I was 10 years old a few years later when Israel became independent, 1948 May, which was the exact same month that the apartheid regime came to power through a whites-only election. And in its ranks and leadership were many people who had been imprisoned during the war by the Smuts regime for their support for the Nazis, and had been in Nazi Germany or in Germany just prior to that time, like Dr. Verwoerd. But what influenced me very much as a kid, coming not from a very political family at all, secular Jews, we went to synagogue now and again, I bar mitzvahed. My mother and father weren't intellectuals. They were mildly Zionist, but they were people who had an approach to life and other human beings based on the golden rule, which I, as a kid, thought was only a rule in terms of the Jewish religion, and not that of the Christian and the Muslim and other religions. The golden rule being, as my mother used to explain to me so often, you must respect other people. Don't do hateful things to them. You wouldn't like them to do hateful things to you. So that gave me an empathy with what every white, anybody in South Africa could see. And that was the way that Black people were being treated. And my mother used to say to me, don't behave to people like that, and don't use the crude language about such people that you hear from some of your uncles and your neighbors, etc. It was in high school that we had a wonderful history teacher who happened, by the way, to be Jewish. It was, you know, it didn't matter that he was Jewish, but he taught the French Revolution. And through his eyes, we could see the ancient regime, the aristocracy and the nobility and the peasants in terms of black and white South Africa. By the time I'd left school, I was moving away from simply being focused on the Jewish community. And I was engaging in the wider community and had friends across the color line when the Sharpeville massacre took place in March 1961. I felt compelled to do something about it, and that meant finding my way into the ranks of the ANC and the Communist Party, courtesy of a relative of mine, also with a similar background of parents and so on from Eastern Europe, because a lot of those who came to South Africa, I mean, not the majority of the whites who came, but quite a significant number were working class, were intellectuals, and they focused or had an approach as socialists, as communists, and Bolsheviks even. And that's what brought me into the struggle. Being involved then in the liberation struggle led to my real growing awareness of not only South Africa and racism and apartheid, but the international issues as well. So I found myself, from having been in the Zionist youth movement as a teenager, becoming further afield from looking to Israel in any way and seeing myself, and this is a choice that Jews like you have made who live in Ireland, seeing myself as a South African, albeit privileged white, of not associating my identity or the country I wanted to live in, being Israel, but rather as a South African. And one of the key lessons that I learned from within the ranks of that movement, and particularly from Jewish people, a small minority of whites who were in this liberation movement, learning that to counter anti-Semitism wasn't to claim nationalism, because we didn't see the Jews as a nation at all. Israel's another matter. But we grew up in South Africa like people growing up, Jewish people everywhere in the world. And the choice was the identification with South Africa as my country. And the fact that if you wanted to counter anti-Semitism, and there was plenty of it in South Africa, given the racism, the white supremacism, and where Verwoerd and Foster and the other leaders had come from, that the way to counter anti-Semitism was not to go into your shell, not to look for a country and create a nation of Jews, but to fight for democracy in the country where you lived and internationally as the best way of opposing, of fighting and eliminating anti-Semitism. So that's my makeup in terms of involvement in the struggle. I'm looking at the clock there and I see I've just got a bit over 5 minutes left. I'd like to say a couple more things, that as I became involved and detached from the community without standing against them, trying to educate people, and with the 6-Day War coming about, at that particular time, finding myself in conflict with relatives, certainly not my immediate family, but with relatives, with friends, I was now in exile and partly in Britain, with Jewish people I knew, apart from socialists. And I must go forward in time to coming back to South Africa after 1990 and the elections that brought about democracy in 1994, as one spoke, as one had to speak, not in my name, against Israel's crimes and the equation of being Jewish with the need to defend Israel and Zionism, and to reject anything that said you were a self-hating Jew or an anti-Semite because you stood up against Israel and Zionism, was something that I raised very strongly, and particularly, as we know from the history and the landmarks, through the dreadful atrocities and crimes carried out against the Palestinian people through the 90s and into the next millennia, increasingly under attack, both in South Africa from the small Zionist community and, of course, from Israel itself. It compelled me to speak in two ways: as a South African, as somebody part of the liberation movement, to mobilize and help mobilize the people of South Africa in support of justice for the Palestinian people, and in terms of being involved with Jewish people in South Africa like yourselves, stating not in our name and standing up for justice in terms of the elimination of racial discrimination, of what's become clearly an apartheid state in Israel, with all the aspects of that incredibly cruel criminal rule and oppression and repression of Palestinian rights. So I had become very involved then in these last 20 years in helping to develop, similarly to yourselves, the broader boycott, divestment and sanctions movement in South Africa, as well as supporting Jews for Justice, and it's a small grouping in South Africa, but I'm linked also to such Jewish groups throughout the world, particularly in Britain, because I have many friends there. I want to lend my voice as powerfully as I can muster to encourage the kind of work that you're doing, to reach across in two ways: to Jews who are prepared to listen and see sense, Jews who will see that in terms of their own security in Israel, where many live, that as in South Africa, it's important to become part of a broader human rights struggle for equality and justice for all people as the road to peace, and to reject the narrative of the Zionists who lay claim to Palestine and have been responsible, those Zionists who rule, for all the crimes committed against the Palestinian people. Let me end then, 15-minute input, I think I've reached that point now, of saying something that is very similar between standing up as a Jew in apartheid South Africa or post-apartheid South Africa, as a Jew in the United States or Canada or Argentina, Brazil, Ireland, Britain, France, Germany, in Israel itself, that it's so important to raise the voice against Zionist supremacists, apartheid, Israel, in terms of exposing the myth, as we did as a small grouping in South Africa composed of wonderful, courageous people like Yonatan, who we'll be hearing from next. It was a very small number, but the very fact that there were whites now, never mind Jewish, although there was a strong contingent or percentage of Jews in the small white minority that stood up against apartheid, white supremacy in South Africa, it exploded the myth of the racists, whether white supremacists in the United States or Germany, in anywhere in the world, in Israel, or as it was in South Africa, that in fact, we were showing that it's possible for people who are white in a white supremacist situation, or Jews in a Jewish Zionist power state, to stand up and say, this is wrong, this is unjust, we reject the racism, we reject apartheid, and it has a profound impact on the people who are repressed, who are suppressed. It made a tremendous difference to the way Black people in South Africa viewed the struggle in South Africa, not through the racial prism. And this is what we all are doing, and particularly those like Ilan Pape and Yonatan and Avi Shlayim and others who are showing Arab people, Palestinian people, people of the Muslim faith, that not all Jews believe in Jewish supremacy and Zionism. So we must carry on this work, and we have the wonderful weapon of BDS, which we saw make tremendous difference in South Africa in isolating the Pretoria racist regime, in inspiring people, the primary factor for change, the people within the struggle, the oppressed people, in their intifada that overcame the resistance that overcame apartheid South Africa, and in the end must and will, because it's a just struggle, will see a change in historic Palestine. Thanks very much for listening to me.